There is a moment that arrives without announcement, without drama, without the kind of noise that warns you something important has changed, and most people do not recognize it when it happens, because nothing external looks different enough to demand attention, yet internally something feels slightly displaced, as if a familiar object has been moved a few inches in a dark room, and you only notice when your hand reaches for it and finds empty space. It begins as a mild confusion, not fear, not anger, just a quiet sense that a choice you would have made without thinking now arrives already shaped by someone else's expectation. You still decide technically, but the decision feels thinner, lighter, pre-approved. You notice it in small moments that seem unworthy of reflection. Someone suggests a different time, a different route, a different way of doing something you have done for decades. The suggestion sounds reasonable. You agree without resistance. Later, alone, you cannot remember why you agreed so easily. You tell yourself it was easier. You tell yourself it did not matter. And perhaps it did not by itself. The change does not arrive as loss. It arrives as convenience. It arrives as relief. It arrives as concern wearing a gentle face. It arrives wrapped in kindness, in efficiency, in the unspoken assumption that fewer decisions might be better now. You still wake up in the same body, in the same home, with the same memories, but something subtle has shifted in how the world speaks to you, and more importantly, how it waits or no longer waits for your response. You begin to sense that time around you has accelerated while your role within it has narrowed. Conversations move past your pauses. Plans form before your opinion is requested. You are included, but not centered. You are informed, but not consulted. No one says you are incapable. No one needs to. The language changes first. It becomes softer, slower, more explanatory. Sentences arrive padded, careful, simplified, as if complexity might tire you. Questions turn into statements. Options turn into recommendations. You notice yourself nodding more often than speaking. When you do speak, you sometimes feel the need to justify why your preference still makes sense, as though preference itself now requires defense. The most unsettling part is not that others begin to adjust their behavior around you, but that you begin to adjust yourself to fit it. You start anticipating the suggestion before it is spoken. You edit your desires to align with what will cause the least friction. You choose the path that will draw the least attention. You tell yourself this is maturity. You tell yourself this is peace. You tell yourself you are tired of unnecessary decisions. And maybe that is partly true, but beneath that explanation, there is another feeling, quieter, harder to name, a sense that something personal has been placed just out of reach, not taken, not forbidden, simply assumed unnecessary. The world does not push you aside. It gently steps in front of you. It holds the door, but also decides which door you should walk through. At first, you are grateful. Then you are unsure. Then you are silent. This is not the loss of strength. This is not the loss of intelligence. This is not even the loss of independence in any visible form. It is the slow erosion of authorship, the sense that your life is still yours, but increasingly narrated by others. You still sign your name. You still choose what to eat, where to sit, when to sleep. But the choices that once defined your rhythm, your priorities, your sense of control, begin to shrink in scale. The decisions left to you are safe ones, harmless ones, cosmetic ones. The meaningful ones arrive already framed. You are asked to agree, not to decide, and you begin to notice how often language does the work that force never needs to, how a simple phrase can redirect without confrontation, how concern can replace consent, how tone can accomplish what authority once required. You notice how often the words for you are chosen carefully, and how rarely the words from you are allowed to stand alone. When you say you will do something, someone suggests a better way. When you express a preference, someone offers an improvement. When you hesitate, someone fills the space. The pauses that once belonged to you are no longer respected. Silence becomes uncomfortable, so others speak for you. You do not protest. Because nothing overt has been done, there is no injustice to point to, no moment dramatic enough to justify resistance. And so the change continues quietly, invisibly, carried forward by politeness and good intentions. You begin to feel a strange dislocation, as if your inner world is intact, but increasingly disconnected from the outer one. You still think deeply. You still observe. You still weigh decisions carefully, but fewer people ask what you think. Fewer moments require your judgment. You are present, but peripheral, included, but buffered. You start to sense that the world is no longer calibrated to your timing. It moves faster, speaks louder, decides sooner. And rather than demanding space, you step back, telling yourself, this is how things are now. The discomfort is not sharp. It is dull. It does not demand action. It lingers. It settles. It becomes background noise, and that is why it is dangerous. Because anything loud enough to hurt is also loud enough to resist. But this arrives softly. It arrives through words that sound helpful, through phrases that suggest ease, through language that removes weight from your decisions until they feel optional, then unnecessary. You may notice it first when someone says you do not need to worry about that anymore, or when they say they will take care of it for you, or when they say it might be too much trouble. Each phrase lands gently. Each phrase carries an implication that your effort, your judgment, your agency is now something to be managed, and because the intention sounds kind, you accept it without protest. You tell yourself it is not worth pushing back. You tell yourself it is easier this way. You tell yourself you have already lived enough life to not need control over every detail. And yet something inside you tightens when another choice passes without your input. Something inside you withdraws when your opinion is acknowledged but not acted upon. Something inside you grows quieter, not because it has nothing to say, but because it has learned it will not be heard in time. This is the beginning, though it does not announce itself as such. It does not feel like loss. It feels like being slightly outpaced, slightly softened, slightly reclassified. You are still respected, but in a different category. Still valued, but differently weighted. Still trusted, but within narrower boundaries. The shift is not imposed. It is negotiated through language, through tone, through habit, through repetition. And the most profound change happens when you begin to internalize it, when you stop offering opinions unless asked, when you stop asserting preferences unless necessary, when you begin to see your own decisiveness as something that might inconvenience others. That is when autonomy begins to thin, not because it has been taken, but because it has been set aside. You do not feel oppressed, you feel managed. You do not feel silenced, you feel summarized. Your complexity is reduced for efficiency. Your unpredictability is smoothed for comfort. And you participate in this reduction because resistance feels disproportionate to the offense. There is no single moment to point to and say this is when it happened. There is only a gradual realization that something once instinctive now requires effort, that asserting yourself now feels like disruption rather than expression, that choosing differently now feels like explaining yourself. This is the awareness phase, though it does not feel like insight. It feels like disorientation, like standing in a familiar room where the furniture has been rearranged while you were away. You can still move through it, but you must pay attention now. The automatic ease is gone, and in that attention a question begins to form, quietly, without urgency, without demand. When did this change? And more unsettling, why did I let it feel normal? The patterns reveal themselves slowly, not because they are hidden, but because they are familiar enough to pass unnoticed, woven into everyday interactions that appear benign on the surface and even caring in tone. Once awareness has settled, once that quiet unease has been acknowledged rather than dismissed, the mind begins to replay moments that once felt insignificant and now appear connected, like small stones forming a path that had been there all along. You begin to see how often help arrives before consent is given, not because someone intends to override you, but because they assume the answer. They assume relief will be welcome. They assume guidance will be appreciated. They assume that fewer decisions must feel like kindness, and so they step in, not forcefully, not arrogantly, but confidently, carrying certainty on your behalf. You are no longer asked what you want to do, but told what will be done, framed as assistance. The words are gentle, the implications are firm. You notice how frequently phrases begin with concern rather than curiosity, How rarely someone pauses long enough for you to finish a thought before offering a solution. You notice how the language shifts from open questions to closed loops. We will handle that. It is better this way. You should not worry about it. You begin to understand that control rarely announces itself as control. It presents itself as efficiency, as protection, as anticipation. The subtlety lies in how permission quietly changes hands without ceremony. One day you are choosing, the next you are agreeing, and the day after that you are being informed. No one asks if the transition is acceptable. It unfolds naturally, almost invisibly, because everyone involved believes they are doing the right thing. And perhaps they are from their perspective. But intention does not erase consequence. You start to see how concern can become a substitute for listening, how worry can become justification, how responsibility can be redefined as burden, and burden can be removed without ever asking whether you wanted it removed. The pattern is not aggressive. It is paternal. It carries an unspoken hierarchy, where experience is respected but agency is quietly downgraded. You are still admired for what you have done, but less trusted for what you will do next. You are thanked for your past contributions, while your present choices are guided. You notice how often someone says, "Let me do that for you," even when you have not expressed difficulty. You notice how often your refusal is met with reassurance rather than acceptance, as if saying no is simply a sign you have not yet understood how much easier it could be if you agreed. You begin to recognize the emotional choreography. First comes the offer, then the reassurance, then the insistence disguised as care, and if you persist, the tone shifts slightly, not to anger, but to disappointment, as though your desire to decide for yourself has caused unnecessary tension. Over time, you learn which battles are not worth the emotional cost. You begin to conserve energy by yielding early. You tell yourself you are choosing harmony. You tell yourself this is wisdom, but beneath that explanation lies a pattern of quiet surrender. You start to see how routines become rails, how schedules become scripts written by others, how your day fills with activities that were planned around you rather than with you. You are included in the outcome, but excluded from the design. The recognition sharpens when you notice how often people speak about you in your presence rather than to you, not disrespectfully, casually, as if your role in the conversation is to confirm rather than contribute. You notice how decisions about your time are made while you are still adjusting to the idea that a decision was needed. You notice how phrases like "it is probably best" or "we thought it would be easier" quietly erase the space where your judgment once lived. And because these patterns repeat, because they are reinforced by habit, they begin to feel inevitable. You start to anticipate them. You begin to preemptively agree. You adjust your expectations downward to avoid disappointment. You stop initiating conversations that might invite correction. You start framing your desires as suggestions rather than statements. You soften your language to match the tone being used with you. And in doing so, you participate in the pattern. Not because you lack awareness, but because resisting it feels emotionally expensive. Recognition does not arrive as outrage. It arrives as clarity tinged with fatigue. You see the mechanics now. You see how help becomes control not through domination, but through repetition, through the steady replacement of choice with recommendation, through the normalization of being guided. You see how concern becomes permission to decide for you, not because you granted it explicitly, but because you stopped challenging it implicitly. And perhaps the most difficult recognition is realizing how easily this process can be internalized, how quickly you begin to question your own preferences before anyone else does, how often you abandon an idea because you anticipate it will be dismissed, how frequently you silence yourself to maintain equilibrium. You notice the internal dialogue shifting. You hear yourself thinking, maybe they are right, maybe it is easier, maybe it does not matter. These thoughts feel reasonable, they feel adult, they feel calm, but they are also signals that autonomy is being reframed as inconvenience, that decisiveness is being reinterpreted as stubbornness, that independence is being recast as risk. You begin to see how language trains behavior, how certain words gently redirect your posture in the world, how phrases meant to protect you also contain expectations about limitation. You see how the same words repeated often enough become truth, not because they are accurate, but because they are unchallenged. The recognition is not bitter. It is sobering. It carries a sense of understanding rather than accusation. You realize that no one sat down and decided to reduce your autonomy. It happened through accumulation, through small, reasonable adjustments, through the steady belief that helping means deciding. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You begin to hear the pattern everywhere, in the way plans are discussed, in the way options are narrowed before being presented, in the way your capacity is assumed rather than assessed. And with that recognition comes a quieter, heavier question. Not why they are doing this, but why it feels so easy to accept, why resistance feels like disruption, why asserting your will now carries an emotional price you did not expect. This is where recognition deepens. It turns inward. You begin to understand that the most effective control does not require force. It requires cooperation, and cooperation is easily obtained when the language sounds caring, when the intentions seem good, when the alternative feels exhausting. You see how autonomy is not removed. It is negotiated away in increments. And the negotiation happens so subtly that you barely remember agreeing to the terms. There is a weight that settles once recognition turns into lived reality, a heaviness that is not dramatic enough to demand expression, but persistent enough to change how you move through the world. It is the weight of being repositioned without being asked. Not pushed aside, not discarded, but gently relocated into a role that feels smaller than the one you inhabited before. You feel it when people speak to you differently, not with disrespect, but with a tone that assumes fragility where there is only experience. You hear it in the way sentences are slowed, simplified, softened, as if complexity might be unkind. You notice how your words are met with reassurance rather than engagement, as though your perspective is something to be managed rather than explored. The loss is not of capability, but of standing. You are still present, but your presence carries less authority. You are still included, but your inclusion feels conditional. The emotional weight comes from realizing that this change is not temporary, not accidental, and not easily reversed by a single assertion of will. It is structural. It is embedded in how others now perceive your place. You feel it when you are spoken about in the third person, while sitting in the same room. When decisions are explained to you after they have already been made, when your agreement is assumed rather than sought. There is a quiet humiliation in being managed, even when the management is kind, not because you resent help, but because help has replaced dialogue. You are no longer consulted as an equal participant. You are accommodated. And accommodation, while comfortable on the surface, carries an unspoken message that you are now an exception to be handled carefully rather than a force to be reckoned with. The loss sharpens when you notice how your objections are received, not argued with, not debated, but soothed, as if disagreement itself is a symptom to be addressed rather than a position to be respected. You sense the shift when your frustration is interpreted as stress, your firmness as stubbornness, your independence as denial. Language reframes your inner life in ways that make it easier for others to override it. You feel the emotional toll of having to justify your competence, not through action, but through tone. You find yourself softening your voice to be taken seriously, moderating your language to avoid being dismissed as difficult. You become aware of how often you preface your opinions with disclaimers, how frequently you reassure others that you are fine, how quickly you backtrack when resistance meets concern. The loss is cumulative. Each small concession leaves a residue. Each time you are guided rather than asked, something inside you withdraws slightly. Not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. You begin to conserve emotional energy by disengaging. You speak less. You volunteer fewer ideas. You accept plans you did not choose because the effort required to alter them feels disproportionate to the outcome. Over time, this disengagement begins to feel like apathy, but it is not. It is grief without ceremony. Grief for a version of yourself who moved through the world without having to prove their right to decide. Grief for the ease with which your preferences once shaped reality. You notice how your identity begins to shift under the weight of this repositioning. You are no longer seen primarily as an individual with desires, opinions, and agency, but as a category, older, slower, in need of oversight. Even when you defy the stereotype through action, the category remains. Your competence becomes surprising rather than expected. Your independence becomes impressive rather than normal, and while praise may follow, it carries a backhanded quality, reinforcing the very assumptions it seems to challenge. You feel the loss most acutely in moments of silence, when you realize no one is waiting for your input. When conversations move forward without pausing for your perspective. When plans are finalized without checking your availability. You are still invited, still included, but the invitation arrives after the structure is already in place. You are fitting into a frame rather than shaping it. The emotional weight deepens when you recognize how this repositioning affects how you see yourself. You begin to internalize the lowered expectations. You question your own impulses. You second-guess your decisions before anyone else does. You hesitate where you once acted. You measure the potential inconvenience of your preferences against the comfort of others. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, you begin to self-manage. You preemptively restrict yourself to avoid being restricted by others. This is perhaps the most painful loss, because it is invisible. It happens inside. You still appear autonomous on the surface, you still make choices. But the range of those choices has narrowed, not because you cannot choose more, but because you no longer feel entitled to. You have learned the emotional cost of asserting yourself, and you weigh that cost carefully each time. You notice how often you choose silence over explanation, agreement over insistence, compliance over confrontation, not because you lack conviction, but because the environment no longer rewards it. The loss is also relational. You sense a subtle distance forming between you and others, not because they have pulled away, but because the dynamic has changed. You are cared for, but not challenged, protected, but not trusted. There is a loneliness in this that is difficult to articulate because it exists alongside attention and concern. You are not abandoned, you are overseen, and oversight, when it replaces mutuality, erodes intimacy. Conversations become transactional, interactions become functional. You are valued for your safety rather than your insight. You begin to miss being argued with, being disagreed with, being taken seriously enough to provoke resistance. The absence of friction becomes its own form of isolation. You are spoken to as someone to be reassured rather than someone to be convinced. And over time you may begin to doubt the relevance of your own inner life. You may wonder whether your desires still matter, whether your opinions still carry weight, whether your sense of self is still aligned with the world around you. The loss is not catastrophic, it is quiet. It unfolds over months and years. It settles into routine, and because it lacks drama, it lacks witnesses. No one notices the internal contraction. No one marks the moment when you stop offering your full self. You carry it alone. You carry the knowledge that you have been repositioned, that your role has shifted, that your autonomy has been diluted through kindness. You carry the fatigue of navigating an environment that no longer meets you where you stand. And perhaps the heaviest part of this loss is the awareness that protesting it now feels out of character. That reclaiming space feels like disruption. That asserting authority feels like an overreaction. You have been so thoroughly repositioned that resistance seems almost inappropriate. And so the loss persists, not because it is enforced, but because it has become normalized. You continue to function, you continue to participate, but something essential has been set aside. Not destroyed, not erased, simply unused, waiting. Clarity does not arrive as a surge of confidence or a sudden reclaiming of ground. It arrives quietly, almost apologetically, as a realization that forms beneath the noise rather than cutting through it. There is no dramatic reversal, no declaration, no visible shift in how the world treats you. The clarity is internal. It begins when you stop asking why this happened and start observing where it actually lives. You notice that despite everything that has changed around you, despite the softened language and redirected decisions, there remains a space that has not been touched. It is not located in your schedule, or your mobility, or your relevance to others. It exists deeper than that. You realize that what has been eroded is not autonomy itself, but its outward expression. The authority to decide has been nudged, reframed, redirected, but the capacity to choose has not disappeared. It has simply been quieted by habit, and habits, once seen clearly, lose some of their power. You begin to understand that autonomy was never truly granted by others, even when it appeared that way. It was always an internal position, one you carried long before anyone began to comment on your pace or simplify their sentences around you. The clarity sharpens when you recognize that much of what feels lost was never forcibly taken. It was surrendered in small increments, often for reasons that made sense at the time. Convenience, harmony, fatigue. You see now that these reasons were not wrong, but they were incomplete. They explained the behavior, but they did not define your identity. You realize that dignity does not reside in how often you are asked, but in whether you still answer yourself honestly. Control does not live in the outcome of decisions, but in the relationship you have with your own judgment. Choice exists even when it is constrained, even when it is unseen. The mistake was not yielding occasionally. The mistake was believing that yielding altered who you are. With this clarity comes a subtle recalibration. You stop measuring your autonomy by external markers. You stop expecting others to restore something they never fully owned. You understand that waiting to be asked is a passive stance, and passivity invites management. This is not a call to confrontation. It is a shift in posture. You begin to notice the moments where your internal response precedes your external one, where you already know what you prefer before you consider how it will be received. You begin to respect that internal signal again, even if you choose not to act on it every time. That respect changes everything. You see that autonomy is not proven through defiance, but through alignment, through the quiet act of not abandoning your own perspective, simply because it might complicate someone else's plans. You realize that others may continue to speak to you in softened tones, may continue to offer solutions before questions, may continue to assume. But clarity shows you that these behaviors only define the outer terrain. They do not dictate your inner authority unless you allow them to. You begin to see the difference between cooperation and surrender, between peace and disappearance, between choosing rest and relinquishing self. The clarity is steady, not energizing. It does not urge you to reclaim every decision or correct every assumption. It simply reorients you to where the center actually is. You recognize that dignity fades before strength, because dignity is internal, and when it is neglected, strength becomes irrelevant. You may still be physically capable. You may still be mentally sharp. But without internal authorship, these qualities drift without anchor. Clarity restores that anchor. You stop needing validation for your preferences. You stop over-explaining. You allow yourself to hold opinions without immediately translating them into socially acceptable language. You accept that some of your choices will be misunderstood, and that misunderstanding does not equal error. You understand that autonomy cannot be taken unless it is surrendered internally. Others can influence your environment, your options, your context. They cannot occupy your inner position unless you vacate it. This realization does not make interactions easier. In some ways, it makes them more complex, because you are no longer moving automatically. You are aware now. You notice when you are about to agree out of habit, rather than conviction. You notice when you are about to silence yourself out of anticipation, rather than judgment. And sometimes you still choose to yield, but the choice is conscious. It belongs to you again. You also come to understand that reclaiming internal authority does not require announcement. It does not require others to notice. It does not require a shift in how they behave. It requires a refusal to disappear quietly inside yourself. You may still accept help. You may still appreciate concern. But you no longer confuse assistance with identity. You no longer allow language to define your limits without your consent. You see that many of the words that once diminished, you only had power because you accepted their framing. Once you stop doing that, their effect weakens, not outwardly but internally where it matters. Clarity also brings a sober acceptance. You understand that some changes are real, that time has altered certain capacities, that the world does move faster, that not every role can be reclaimed. And you do not argue with these truths. You simply separate them from the false conclusions that were attached to them. Reduced speed does not mean reduced authority. Changed priorities do not mean diminished relevance. Needing support does not erase sovereignty. You hold these distinctions carefully, without defensiveness. You recognize that autonomy is not about control over everything. It is about ownership of self, And that ownership can coexist with limitation. The clarity settles into your daily awareness. It changes how you listen. You hear suggestions without absorbing their assumptions. You receive advice without internalizing judgment. You allow others to help without allowing them to define you. And when you do speak, you do so from a grounded place, not to assert dominance, but to remain present in your own life. You stop performing compliance. You stop narrating your decisions to make them palatable. You begin to trust the quiet certainty that does not need reinforcement. This clarity does not restore what was lost externally. It does not guarantee respect. It does not prevent others from continuing to manage, simplify, or decide prematurely. But it changes the internal equation. You are no longer waiting for permission to exist fully. You are no longer negotiating your self-respect in exchange for ease. You are no longer mistaking silence for peace. You understand now that autonomy was never something to be defended loudly. It was something to be inhabited quietly. And in that understanding, something steadies. The contraction that once lived in your chest eases slightly, not because the world has changed, but because you have relocated the source of authority back where it belongs, inside. Quiet autonomy does not announce itself. It does not arrive with corrected behavior from others or visible shifts in how decisions are presented to you. It settles inwardly, almost unnoticed, like a posture adjustment you make without thinking that suddenly allows you to breathe more fully. There is no urge to explain yourself, no desire to prove anything, no need to reclaim territory that was never meant to be defended in public. The change is subtle but decisive. You begin to occupy yourself again, not the role others assign, not the category you have been placed into, but the internal position you never truly lost. You wake up with a steadier sense of authorship. The day may still bring suggestions, interventions, assumptions, but they no longer rearrange your inner landscape. You listen without shrinking. You consider without yielding reflexively. You decide without rehearsing justifications in advance. Quiet autonomy expresses itself first in restraint. You no longer rush to agree to keep things smooth. You no longer rush to refuse to protect pride. You allow yourself to pause not as hesitation, but as ownership of timing. Silence becomes a choice rather than a consequence. When you speak, you do not fill space. You place words where they belong. You discover that you can refuse the role without confrontation simply by not inhabiting it. You stop performing gratitude for decisions you did not request. You stop apologizing for preferences that still feel true. You stop editing your desires to match expectations before they are voiced. This does not make you rigid. It makes you precise. You accept help without surrendering authorship. You accept limits without internalizing diminishment. You understand that quiet autonomy is not about reclaiming control over others, but about withdrawing consent from narratives that quietly reduced you. You no longer argue with softened language. You hear it, register it, and let it pass without embedding itself. You no longer correct every assumption. You let reality speak through consistency rather than explanation. Your calm becomes your boundary. Your steadiness becomes your signal. Others may continue to decide prematurely. They may continue to frame options narrowly, but you no longer experience these moments as erasure. They are external movements, not internal verdicts. You remain present in your own thinking. You remain aligned with your own values. You stop measuring dignity by how often you are deferred to and start measuring it by how rarely you abandon yourself. Quiet autonomy reshapes how you move through relationships. You listen more carefully, not to comply, but to understand where alignment is possible and where it is not. You no longer take responsibility for other people's discomfort with your independence. You no longer soften your convictions to preserve harmony that requires your disappearance. At the same time, you do not seek conflict. You do not announce boundaries. You simply live inside them. You notice that when you stop signaling uncertainty about your own position, fewer explanations are demanded. Not because others suddenly respect you more, but because you are no longer negotiating your place. You stand where you stand. Quiet autonomy also changes how you experience age itself. You stop seeing it as a gradual narrowing and start experiencing it as a refinement. Fewer impulses compete for attention. Fewer external validations matter. You are no longer distracted by the need to be included in every decision to feel whole. You choose involvement deliberately. You withdraw deliberately. Both are acts of agency. You understand that autonomy after 60 does not look like it did at 30. It is not loud, it is not expansive, it is selective. It is the ability to remain internally self-directed even when the external world simplifies you. It is the refusal to let concern rewrite your identity. It is the discipline of staying mentally upright in environments that subtly encourage you to lean back. You no longer fear being seen as difficult because you are no longer trying to be seen at all. You exist. You decide. You adjust when necessary without internal collapse. You notice that your sense of dignity no longer fluctuates with how others speak to you. It is stable. It is unreactive. It does not need reinforcement. Quiet autonomy does not restore the past. It does not recreate the conditions where your authority was assumed. It accepts that the world has shifted, that perceptions have changed, that some doors now open differently. But it also understands that the most consequential door was never external. It was the one between your awareness and your will. That door is now open again. You live from that opening. You do not announce it. You do not defend it. You do not explain it. You simply stop leaving yourself behind in small moments. You choose when to engage. You choose when to step back. You choose when to accept guidance and when to decline it without resistance. This is not rebellion. It is alignment. You are no longer performing autonomy. You are inhabiting it. And because it is quiet, because it is internal, because it does not seek validation, it is difficult to take away. You may still be underestimated. You may still be managed at times. But you are no longer reduced, not internally, and that is where power was always meant to live.